Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I just want to check you can hear us okay. So if you can just give a little emoji to say a thumbs up, that would be great. Or in the chat function, so we know you're here and with us, that'd be perfect. So I wanted to also thank you for coming. It's really nice to see so many people joining again for another HR Masterclass. Some of you may know me, some of you may know OpenUp, but some of you won't, of course. So I wanted to introduce myself and the business. So I'm Ben, and I'm one of our partnerships managers here at OpenUp, and I focus on the UK and Ireland. Like many of us here, as you can imagine, I joined to develop our mission to remove barriers in regards to mental well-being, and really to envisage the measures that Heist has of making it accessible to everyone. And Heist is the founder of our business. And with our platform, we offer support for mental well-being of employees in actually over 1,500 companies across the world. And for example, we really do this by a few different ways. We do one-on-one sessions with our psychologists and lifestyle experts. We have group sessions on many different themes, both work and lifestyle related, and a huge array of kind of online courses and content so people can work and learn at their own time. And of course, we really know the importance of supporting organizations through their HR and leadership teams so that people like you guys who are here can really make a meaningful impact for your teams. And that's really why we host these sessions like our HR Masterclass. And that's why we're very happy to welcome Lucy. So what you can expect today is we'll be talking about the topic of HR strategies to support mental well-being in times of change. And I'm sure you agree, the past few years, there's been a lot of change. So Lucy will run through everything, and then we will have time afterwards for a Q&A where she can answer some of your questions directly. So do feel free to ask questions as we go in the question section or in the comment sections, and we'll try and cover as many as time permit at the end of that. Something nice to know and a cool feature, if you're struggling to come up with a question, we have an upvote system on the questions. So any that you see that you're very interested in knowing more about, you can upvote, and then that helps me select them for the Q&A. But for now, enjoy the session. And yeah, as I said, feel free to use the tools to interact with the chat and the emojis. And I'd very much like to welcome our guest, Lucy Adams, CEO of Disruptive HR. So I'll jump off the screen now, Lucy, and leave it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this session. And thank you to everybody who's joining at this. I'm assuming it's kind of late in the day for all of you. And we were having a conversation about, is this a good time to run it, or should it be earlier? And of course, you're never going to please everybody, are you? But I just think it's fantastic that we've got so many people who are joining, and obviously other people who've signed up to get the recording. I should introduce myself. Ben, as Ben said, I am the Chief Executive of Disruptive HR, which is a slightly controversial title for a business. I've been running Disruptive HR for 9 years now. It's our 10-year anniversary next year. And I started Disruptive HR really because as an HR practitioner myself, I'd been an HR director of some large organizations. Probably the one that you will have heard of was the BBC, where I headed up HR there for 5 years. It was really kind of during my time in those HR leadership roles that I kind of got frustrated with how we were still doing HR and all of the associated elements, including health and well-being, in quite traditional ways. And there I could see my leaders and my employees who were going through unbelievable challenges and changes. And yet there was I still doing things in HR in the ways that I've kind of been doing them in the 1990s. And you probably won't be old enough to remember the 1990s, but I was still doing HR at that point. And so Disruptive HR came about as a means of trying to change the way that we do things, and to kind of innovate and do things in very progressive and different ways that are much more relevant for a disrupted world. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today in relation to mental health. I'm just going to open up my slides. There we go. So in talking about kind of the strategies that we need to put in place to help with mental well-being during times of change, and a quick brand change there to Disruptive HR branding. And of course, there has been huge amounts of change, right? There, you know, we were challenged and changing even before we had the cost of living crisis, and before that COVID. But, we know that people have been struggling and that issues around mental health and well-being are bigger than they've ever been before. And in some ways, that's a real positive, because for the first time, we started to have those conversations. It has become something that it becomes quite normal to talk about. I still think there are some stigmas associated with it in certain quarters, but the agenda of health and well-being is no longer something that would have been unheard of 10, 15, 20 years ago. So that's a positive. The downside is that we know that there are people who are really struggling with their mental well-being. And I don't profess to be a mental well-being expert. I'm an HR practitioner. So what I'm going to be talking about with you today is kind of the strategies that HR can put in place to help employees and managers think about mental well-being, particularly in times of change. So part of that is understanding how employees react to change and strategies for dealing with that. How you can build a range of data and insights to help you design your approach to change, to make sure that you're really thinking about which buttons to press, which ones to avoid. How you can create a culture where people actually feel supported and feel able to manage their own mental well-being. There's a technique that we're going to look at, which is around using employee persona, which is actually a marketing technique to really think about how you communicate change effectively. And then we're going to look at how you help managers to actually handle change more effectively than perhaps they're doing so today, because so much of our experience of change comes from our line manager. So it really becomes absolutely important that we're focusing on them in HR. So I'm going to kick off with this might seem fairly obvious, but I think sometimes it's as much about our levels of capacity to deal with change. You just have to look at how we coped with change during the COVID crisis. It was phenomenal, wasn't it? The vast majority of people continued to be productive. They were incredibly resilient. And interestingly, engagement scores, people feeling good about where they worked, actually went up. And those scores have been pretty static for about 20 years. That's because ultimately we have what's called a surge capacity to deal with change. So in an intensive and relatively short period like the COVID crisis, we were able to cope with far more than we can normally. Unfortunately, with this surge capacity, you get to a limit and you can't then sustain. And what's interesting is that a lot of research is kind of going into this, is that we're suffering from change fatigue now. So we really pulled together and we knocked it out of the park when COVID hit. And now actually almost small changes feel too much because our capacity to manage change is diminished. So you might see these signs of change fatigue from amongst your colleagues. The complaints get a little bit louder and they become more frequent. Or there's just that indifference, whereas people might have been up for things, curious, leaning in, there's kind of just that sense of indifference to what's going on. Obviously, they might seem physically tired or they might seem more anxious, but those aren't always the signs that are available to us. Sometimes it can just be that they appear more cynical, that actually, whereas again, they might have been a little bit more open-minded about things, they are more quick to criticize, they are more cynical. So these are often signs of the kind of change fatigue and things that we need to watch out for. I think it's helpful when we're thinking about strategies for dealing with mental well-being in HR, particularly at times of change, is to understand how people react to change. And there's a model that I think is really useful, and you may have come across it, and it's called the SCARF model. It's actually developed and designed by the Neuro Leadership Institute, a guy called David Rock. Really worth following if you're interested in anything to do with change management. He's a real expert on the way that the human brain copes with or doesn't cope with change and how our anxieties can be enhanced. And he uses the SCARF model as a way of describing this. So what it does is help us understand what we are most threatened by. So any change involves some kind of threat. We all have different responses to different types of threats. So the SCARF model, as it says there, stands for threats to our status, our sense of certainty, our autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. I just want to unpick those a little bit. So our status can be our position in the organization, or it could be our sense of being an expert, and that might be being challenged. And when we've got changes going on, often that sense of, you know, I was the expert and suddenly I'm out of my comfort zone, that can be a real challenge for some people. Certainty, for some people, they have real high certainty needs. And of course, they're struggling right now because that inability to provide certainty is dominant. I remember, you know, the leaders at the BBC would often come in and say, you know, when are things going to settle down? When are they going to go back to normal? And of course, they're not, are they? You know, change is only going to get faster. Our futures only get more uncertain. So people who have a high threat relationship with lack of certainty are really going to struggle. Autonomy is all about our need to be in control. So that might be, we don't want to be micromanaged. We get a new leader and suddenly they're supervising us. Or it could be that we want to be in control of our physical space, our working environment. So if you've ever tried to introduce hot desking into your area of work, you'll know that some people have a real problem with it. You know, I remember the people at the BBC, they kind of wanted to have their photographs and their biscuits, and, you know, they wanted to know where they went every day for work. The hybrid working piece is actually quite interesting because it gives us greater levels of autonomy about how and when we work. When we take that away from people, they can find that very threatening. Relatedness, as it says, working with people we don't know. So we suddenly need to work with a new team. We need to work with a new leader. Somebody joins the team. For some people, that can be really, can trigger our reactions to change. And then the final one is ostensibly a very human one. And that is our sense of fairness to us or to the people we work with. If something feels unfair, that can trigger this stress response. What we see with stress responses when we're threatened by these changes is the classic fight, flight, or freeze. So instead of us being curious, leaning in, being open-minded, we see tears. We see high levels of anxiety that might paralyze them in terms of inability to do anything, or we might see anger. What we need to do is to help our managers. And what I'll do is I'll send via the team at OpenUp some links. And one of them is a kind of a nice little assessment that you can do to work out what is your threat response. What's the one that really bothers you? For me, sadly, it's status. I don't take any pride in this. I once was told that I had to report to somebody more junior, and I became this person I didn't recognize. You know, I became this kind of sulky, belligerent person. So we suddenly see these behaviors as a result of the changes that we're introducing. If we can be aware of what our team members are feeling and thinking and what might be most problematic for them, doesn't mean to say that we don't implement the change, but we can be more careful with the language. So I was implementing some change with a group of engineers a long time ago, and I was kind of like excited about the changes that we were introducing. Actually, they were horrified. What I should have been doing was emphasizing what was staying the same, because they had a very, very high threat response to uncertainty. So if I'd known that, if I'd got some insight by using this free assessment tool, I could have worked out that whether the way I phrase the changes, we can think about the language, which buttons we want to press, which buttons we want to avoid. So just a helpful way to think about, and there are others out there, but this is a particularly useful one to think about the way in which we respond to change. And we often can't help it. You know, these are automatic reactions that tap into our worst fears. What I want to look at now is if you're designing a strategy for well-being in HR, what are the key elements that should be in there? And quite often we kind of look at our, Zoom yoga and free Fitbits, and we kind of get into a lot of parental style approaches. But what I would advocate is that you think about these three things. All of the research tells us that actually, if we are able to provide the kind of conditions where people feel trusted and they have flexibility and control over their own working lives, if they feel that they are cared about on a personal level, and also that their own career development is thought about and cared about, and also that if they feel that what they do has a purpose and that it matters, that environment will be much less stressful than the best possible environment with Fitbits and yoga and all of that. If we think about these elements, we are creating the conditions where our people can manage their own well-being very effectively. I want to break this down a little bit, and I want to give you some examples of what this looks like in practice in other organizations. So if we pick up this first point about trust me and give me flexibility, we've got a number of examples here. So we have Curve, where they trust their people and they say, we give you a well-being allowance. We're not going to decide what it is that you should have. We expect that you are a grown-up, you know what's best for you. So here's a well-being allowance, and you choose to invest that in a way that you think's right for you. It could be a mindfulness app. It could be some time at the gym. It could be any kind of form of health and well-being activity. But it's ultimately down to you to choose and find the one that works for you. And that's proved very successful for them. At Arkiva, they've invested a lot of time and energy to make sure that people feel that they are in control of their working lives. And so each team manager has something called a hybrid team charter. This is something that the team manager sits down with their team and they work out what is the best form of flexibility and hybrid working that we can do in our part of the organization. Now, they have some people who work on the front line. They're an engineering organization. So they have some people that can't work remotely. But they found that by just allowing individuals the choice about where that flexibility could come in, changes to shift patterns, different starting times, and so on, that engagement scores and the sense of well-being dramatically improved, absenteeism diminished, complaints about not being able to cope went down. They recognize absenteeism, as I mentioned, as well as churn reduced. So thinking about how can you enable a conversation with managers and their teams to work out what flexibility could work for them. I think sadly, we've gone for a one-size-fits-all, 3 days in the office, 2 days out, which doesn't really embrace the true benefits of providing a trusting and flexible working environment. And you may have questions around that as we go through. Linked to that, I like the approach that Telenor have taken, and this is where they've encouraged their managers to give greater levels of autonomy by adopting what they call a tight, loose, tight approach to management. So this means this is where managers are really tight on the expectations. This is what I expect. Then they loosen up about how, where, when that work is done, because it enables people to work in ways, at times, and in places that work for them. They give much greater levels of autonomy, and they found that then people can be more innovative. They're prepared to challenge the status quo. They get the work done more effectively. They're incredibly productive. The final tight in this tight, loose, tight approach is then being tight on accountability. This is not about a free-for-all. It's not a hippie commune, but it is about really focusing on that kind of be clear on expectations, allow for greater flexibility for how, where, and when the work gets done, and then tightening up again on accountability. I really like the approach they take at HubSpot, and they've said, look, we're going to start from a position of trust, because we know that when people feel trusted, stress levels go down, well-being improves, absenteeism drops dramatically if people feel they are trusted and they're treated like adults. And so HubSpot say, you know what? We don't have huge amounts of employment policies and that tell people what to do. We have 3 words: use good judgment. And they say, just because someone made a mistake years ago doesn't mean we need a policy or a rule. We don't penalize the many for the mistakes of the few. We only protect against the big stuff. So we, instead of having a social media policy, a sick day policy, a buy your team lunch policy, and end work early because you blah, 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 they say we have 3 words: use good judgment. And they found that this has created an environment when people feel trusted. As I say, stress levels go down, well-being improves. So it's not always about well-being initiatives. It can be about creating an environment where people feel like they're being treated as adults. The next part I mentioned was about care, and I divided it into 2, if you remember. I said care about me and care about my career, and I wanted to deal with those separately because they are slightly different things. So we have examples here of organizations that are kind of investing in that sense of care, and the line manager feeling that they care about them. At Kimpton, the hotel and restaurant chain, they make sure that they get to know new starters. So during onboarding, instead of it being a time of broadcast and telling people stuff, and this is what we expect of you, they use it as a time to find out about them. They find out about, who are they? What's special and different about them? And what are their personal preferences for how they like to work? Do they have particular means of communication that they respond better to? Do they have particular times of the day when they're most productive? Are they a night owl or an early bird? And the manager, as far as possible, will try and accommodate those personal preferences. So it's basically saying from the outset, when you join us, we want to find out about you, and we want to respond as much as we can to you and your needs. At Atlassian, they've got rid of their traditional performance management process, which is all about judging people, assessing people. And instead, what they've done is to look at their performance management process to include a human dimension. So managers there ask 3 questions of their employees every week. What are you working on? How can I help? And how are you feeling? So managers are doing this on a regular basis. It's not a big set piece where they're brought into a room and given some feedback on last year's objectives. It's much more around those kind of regular conversations, asking about their work, but also asking about them on a human level. At Harry's, they take an approach which is called golden time. And this is just a very simple technique which shows that managers and the organization don't just trust you, but they also care about you. And so they say, you don't have to ask permission, and you don't have to write into your calendar, I'm going to the doctor's, or I'm going to the gym, or I'm picking my child up from school. You just write golden time in. And there is an assumption that you will be trusted to manage that for yourself. Okay, so now obviously there's going to be the odd people who abuse that, but the vast majority of people come to work to do a decent job, to behave decently. And occasionally they need time for themselves. And, obviously OpenUp is very much in this space. It's all about sometimes you just need that time to talk to somebody, to go and do something for yourself, invest in your own well-being. At Harry's, you don't have to specify what that is or get permission. You just write in golden time to your calendar, and that's sacrosanct. That is now something that that they don't pry. It's up to you. You manage it. We trust you. At Dropbox, what they did was to show that they care by introducing stay conversations, and these are becoming more and more popular. And what they found with these stay conversations, where they ask questions like, why did you join Dropbox? Is there anything that we could be doing differently? What would make you stay, and so on? What they found was that all of the kind of jazzy health and well-being initiatives that they'd introduced like the free breakfasts and massages in the office, that actually those were not the things that necessarily people needed and wanted. What they said was, I want to feel like I'm progressing in my career, and my manager is going to help me with that. and that also I've got the tools to be as productive as I can be. Those were the things that really helped people's sense of well-being. So that care doesn't always have to be the fancy investments in well-being that perhaps we've seen in recent years. It can be as simple as making sure that my manager actually has a conversation with me every now and again. Talking of career and being interested in career, I just want to cover quickly, because I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure we've got time for questions, is how one of the key things to make people feel good about where they work and that sense of health and well-being at work is that they feel that their manager and the organization cares about their career development. And there's just some interesting ways of doing it. So some examples for you. We've got Zappos, and what they do is they have something called experience tours. And this is where you get to shadow colleagues in different departments. It's not a big formal scheme, but it's very low cost, but it provides a real opportunity to test out different roles. It's quite similar to the Stretch program. They have a lateral movement initiative called the Stretch program, which gives you a formal way to kind of try on another role. Again, relatively low cost. It's basically 1 day a week. You can go and try out a role in another part of the organization to see if it's for you. At Treehouse, what they do is they kind of share around the leadership. So individual employees get the opportunity to be the leader for that day. So they get to experience what it's like to be a leader. Then manager then coaches them on kind of what they've learned. But again, a very cheap and cheerful way of investing in people's development. At Gene Tech, what they've done is to develop a platform which they call Mentor Marketplace, where employees can drive and own it for themselves, and they can reach out and connect with anyone in the organization who's on the platform as a possible mentor. Because again, having somebody outside of your direct line might be more appropriate. And again, I know this is where OpenUp have come in, because they provide that ability to talk to somebody who isn't directly your boss, when sometimes that can feel more problematic. Okay, so care about my career. And then to kind of sort of finish up on the kind of strategies that we need to think about. And then we're going to look at how you can introduce some of these things. One of the things we know about is that if people feel that they are contributing, if they feel that they are adding value, if they feel that they're doing something that matters, that can be hugely powerful in terms of retention, well-being, reducing stress levels, improving resilience. So just some examples of how organizations have done this, because we tend to feel that purpose has got to be about saving the planet or doing something heroic. Whereas actually what it can be is just feeling like you are connecting to the end customer, that has real value, that you're not just operating in isolation, you're doing something that has real meaning. So at Salesforce, they ensure that all of their people have at least some contact with the customer, the end customer. So they shadow customer support representatives, and they hear and understand what customers are asking. At Adobe, they have things called experience-a-thons, which is where members of other teams who aren't directly involved in product development get to spend time listening in to customer queries, but they also get time piloting and early adoption with the product, so they feel like they are part of the organization, the wider organization. At Amgen, which is a pharmaceutical organization, they bring patients or relatives of patients to team meetings. They invite them in to talk about the impact that the product has had on their lives. And that isn't just the pharmacists, but the people in HR and the people in accounts. So they feel that they're part of something, and that can be really powerful in terms of assisting with well-being. And Nestle, what they do is that they make sure that employees spend at least 1 day working alongside the people who help contribute to the products that they make. So that could be farmers, or it could be suppliers or distributors. So there's different ways in which we can kind of connect our people with ensuring that they feel that they have they're doing something of value. It doesn't always have to be that they are saving the planet. So I wanted to finish off by just looking at some quick ways, because it's all very well saying, we'll do all of this wonderful stuff, but how can you implement these strategies? How can you help managers and leaders to be more engaged? And I'm going to just spend 5-10 minutes just going through strategies for implementing these approaches. First and foremost, we need to be led by data and insight. And I don't mean that some of the data that we've had in the past in HR, churn and absenteeism, which can give you some indications, but they're a very, very blunt measure. They often raise more questions than they provide answers. So we say instead, HR teams who are doing things more progressively being much more around a blend of data and insights that they use. So at the co-op, large retail organization, they have something called the colleague voice. And this is really about focus groups, talking to people, not about benefits and pay, but about what does it feel like to be an employee at the co-op? What are the positive experiences and which are the ones that could be experiences that haven't been so great? So it's really about that opportunity to speak up. As we talked about, I know OpenUp obviously provide this. It's a kind of means of feeling that you have a voice. And so this is something that the co-op do. At Virgin Trains, they use observation techniques to make sure that anything they do from the centre is based around the actual life and day of their employees. So they observed a chef on a train or a train driver, a customer service assistant, and they were looking for things like, when are they stressed? When do they see a customer? When are they using their smartphone? When might they have some downtime? When are they together with their team? When do they see their boss, if at all? And they really then kind of got a sense of the shape and pattern of people's days, so that any intervention from the centre was meaningful around when it would be best for that person, that team, rather than when it suited the centre to send out that email or put that training on. At Heineken, they get great data and insights by regular pulse surveys, not just the annual engagement survey, but regular pulse surveys, weekly pulse surveys, where they sample with a variety of questions. They sample employees, and they also ask the question, not just how are you feeling, but what is prompting those feelings? Because it's about getting to the root cause of what is creating that experience for you. If you're feeling stressed, what's causing that stress? Not just the fact that you feel stressed, because they were then able to do something about it. Okay. I think when we look at the managers that we're dealing with, we know that we have some managers that probably should never be near people, right? They took that promotion because they were the best single contributor. They were the best technically. They wanted promotion. They wanted progression. And that's understandable. That's all fine. But they have no intention of perhaps thinking about their team members on a human level. They don't deal with the stress of or well-being issues effectively. And I think what we need to do is to work out and think about using persona. So personas are a marketing technique, as I mentioned at the outset. It's a marketing technique where you look at the types of people that you have working for you and you cluster them into a kind of fictional persona who would sum up the needs, wants, attributes, motivations, preferences, likes, dislikes, etc. of that type of leader. So here we have Michael. He's kind of old school, a bit resistant to change. He's going to be one of the hardest to deal with. On the other hand, we have Olivia, and Olivia is a bit more curious. She's more open. She's willing to try new things. And then we have Jessica in the middle. And Jessica is not averse to getting involved and engaged with well-being conversations or thinking about handling the issues differently with her team, but she's very results focused. What I would suggest is that we start with the Olivias. We work with our early adopters. We get them engaged. We've all got one or two managers that we could work with. We use the early adopters to try and persuade the Jessicas. And to be honest, we kind of ignore the Michaels. I think we waste so much time in HR, so much valuable talent and energy and resource trying to persuade every Michael to come over to our side. And you know what? They're probably not going to do so. So let's take the noise out of the system. Say to the Michaels, this isn't for you. We're working with other people over here. Chances are they'll be curious if they feel that they don't have to do something. But I do think it's about taking the noise out of the system and working with the ones that are more curious and are more open. When we're thinking about a kind of how we implement these strategies, we do need to think about the different needs of our people. So we're seeing a range of techniques being used. I mentioned the kind of personal preference manual with Kimpton, so I won't repeat that, but it's also being used with Ultranauts. I love Slack's approach where they have set up an Ask Exec Anything channel, Ask Me Anything channel. So it's really framing it so that employees are contributing their thoughts and their ideas and being perhaps encouraged to do so in a much more open way. And also at Square and Amazon do this as well. They have catered for the kind of the introverts in a slightly different way. So instead of just asking the team, what do we think? Actually, it's a way of getting the introverts, giving them the time, the space to contribute their thoughts and ideas. So what they do with their silent meeting is before they let the extroverts in, they have 30 minutes where individuals can contribute to a Google Doc in writing. So they're all sitting together or they're sitting remotely, but they just put their words up on paper. They've given them the time to think and to process before they let the extroverts come in. So just thinking about when we're managing change, how can we best communicate with people? It isn't always going to be through the team meeting or through email. We need to think about what are their personal preferences, what's going to work best for them, what's their particular style. I think also we can be much clearer with our managers about what we expect from them. So at SAP, they don't give them a huge competency framework, but they are very clear on the outcomes that they're expected to deliver. So they say to their managers, we expect you to lead with trust, because as I say, we know that if we show trust with our people, that increases people's sense of well-being. They're expected to show appreciation. Again, we know that if we feel valued and appreciated by our boss, that's going to make us feel better. And also they are expected to coach their team, because if we feel that we're struggling and we don't know where to go to for support, that can be a massive source of stress. So at SAP, they say, these are the 3 things we expect of you as a people manager. Not a huge long list of competencies. Lead with trust, show appreciation, and coach your team. And they also do pulse surveys to measure. So they'll ask people, does your manager give you the autonomy to do your best work? Does your manager let you know that he or she appreciates you? And do you feel that your manager coaches you to do better work? And if you don't get good results as a manager, you don't get to manage people for much longer, and you certainly don't get you don't progress up the ladder. I'll move through these last few quickly, and then we can open it up for questions. I think there's something about when we're looking at health and well-being is to actually reduce it down into small things that individual managers feel they could try. You know, it can all feel very overwhelming, and you know, we sometimes put managers on these detailed and long well-being training programs, and it can be a little bit overwhelming. And I think if we shrink it down, it can be much less threatening for our managers to give it a go, to build their confidence. So at United Technologies, they just asked their people, what's the one thing you want your manager to keep doing? All right. So this isn't a kind of what do you want your manager to stop, which might be a bit more threatening, to keep doing. And it just enabled managers to open up a conversation with their teams about some of the behaviors. Interestingly, if there's a lot of stuff missing, by omission, it's kind of highlighting for that manager that there may be things that aren't as appreciated. But the idea that it's the one thing that they could then focus on. At GoDaddy, they've looked at they look at behavioral change from managers in what they call it, make it micro, reduce it right down. So, for example, HR facilitates conversations with managers around What's the one thing that the manager could do to help you feel more included, to help you feel more valued and appreciated? Again, all of the things that we know contribute. So it doesn't always have to be a big initiative. Sometimes it can just be about kind of getting managers to open up and try one small behavioral change. Talking of keeping it small, it doesn't always have to be a training program. We're seeing more and more HR teams using these behavioral nudges, which are small prompts, small little suggestions that are given to managers to help them think about doing something different. So at Google, they call it a whisper. And when they look at their pulse survey data, let's say that they have a particular group of managers where people are not feeling particularly valued, where they're feeling that they're a bit overwhelmed with the work they've got to do. They will send them on email one small suggestion, like, maybe just thank your team today. They give them these small little prompts, these little pointers about what they could do differently. And they've said that this has been really powerful. Instead of long training programs, they use micro-learning at Freeletics. We know that if we go on a training program, we're going to forget 80% of what we learned in a month, not because we're stupid, but because we're human. So increasingly, we're seeing small micro-learning, a 5-minute video, a 3-minute video, a 2-minute to read toolkit. So again, I know OpenUp has got plenty of these kind of resources. And in fact, let me just share one of these with you. So these are kind of conversation prompts that we can give to managers, nudge them, just give them small suggestions. It just helps them feel more confident rather than they're going into a conversation that might prove a bit more challenging and they might feel that they don't know how to start it. So giving them these conversation starters, and these come from the OpenUp site. So thinking about giving managers small tools, focusing on one or two things that they could do, but also bringing them together, right? So at Zoom Info, they use something called Leadership Lounge, which is peer-to-peer learning. They come together, it's a kind of an hour over lunchtime, and they just bring managers together to talk about something that they might be finding difficult. So it could be, I'm worried about somebody in my team who's feeling stressed. I'm not quite sure what to do about it. And they just hear from each other. Novo Nordisk do something similar. They call it Manager Club, which I think both names are great, actually. And it's just that peer-to-peer learning. So I think this is something that we in HR, we don't have to train them. We don't have to be the expert. Sometimes it's just about hearing from each other. And managers really love these sessions. So it can be a great way of getting them together. So that kind of brings me to the end of this fairly rapid session. Apologies, I've probably gone over by a couple of minutes. I do hope I've left enough time for you to answer your questions. And as Valerie said, please add them to the question section or add them into the chat. It'd be great to hear from you. And I'm just going to wrap up there. I'm not going to read them out to you. You can see all of the questions, the kind of key points that we've covered. So it just really leaves me to say thank you for dialing into this session. And you've got our website down there. If you were interested in looking at some free resources, there's plenty on there. But I'll leave it there for now and hand it back to Ben. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, it's really fascinating to see actually so many initiatives in place kind of firsthand from the real world. And of course, it allows everyone to kind of figure out, all right, what works for us in the structure we have. But yeah, just to have such a high overview is really fascinating. And I really agree on the manager perspective. I think if you can get your managers to empower people, it allows everyone to find this right balance. And of course, so much of that is trust. Yeah. So it was something that really resonated with me. And I think everyone should be looking at, I think every pound spent on a manager is so beneficial for well-being, particularly. Of course, that's what we focus on.
Yeah, because that's our experience very often, isn't it? Our experience is shaped not by the HR team, as much as we'd like to think that is the case. Our experience is shaped day to day by the person who we work for directly. And we know that, and yet we still, sadly, put people into leadership and management roles who perhaps aren't that great. Mm-hmm. And we often then don't do anything about it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really about kind of looking at what hasn't worked with managers in the past has been these kind of mandatory training programs. Instead, it's more about, small suggestions, toolkits, which I know, again, you've got plenty of on OpenUp. But those small suggestions, those small ways of doing things, focusing on the 1 or 2 behavioral changes that they might want to have a go at. I think it's about giving them confidence in this space.
Well, yeah, as you said, on the flip side, you have a lot of very good managers who might not know they are, particularly with change in workplaces, people being promoted. Everyone else knows they're great, but sometimes they lack that self-confidence as well. So honing in on the positive elements of what you did,
Absolutely.
Like one of the examples you get about picking one element they're great at. Everyone else knows they're great at that, and that's what other people will go there for.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, I just wanted to quickly input, but I'll get to some of the questions because I know we have a few. So I will start actually with Deborah here, as I think this kind of actually follows on nicely to what we said about managers. So Deborah's asked if ignoring managers or leaders similar to Michael could lead to inclusion issues within the organization. Could that create a negative environment for not being inclusive as their voice of feedback is not heard?
I think this is such a fundamental question. So thank you for whoever asked this question. And this is the HR dilemma, right? Isn't it? So what we've done typically is to try and compensate for poor managers. Let's call them Michaels. Sorry for any Michaels out there. It's a good shorthand. It's to try and compensate for Michaels by making them do stuff. And I think what we have to ask ourselves is, will the employee's experience be better because of these processes that we've put in place? Will their experience of an appraisal be a positive one if they've got a poor manager who is not interested in doing it and is going into that meeting because they have to? Will their experience be any better because they've done the engagement survey and the cascade action plan? And I think the reality is that if we start with the early adopters, if we then convince, so I'll use the language that I used in the presentation, if we start with the Olivias, bring the Jessicas, do it more by attraction than force, we will persuade some Michaels to come over. But I think as much as possible, we need to think about attraction rather than force. And a really useful way of treating Michael as an adult and just say, you know what, Michael, you don't have to get involved in this. In my experience, they are more interested in getting involved in it if they don't feel they have to than if we make it mandatory. So I think we've got to just use the psychology of this. Whereas what we've done is to spend all of our time thinking about the problem child, and let's dilute what we're going to do to get Michael to be on board. Let's compromise to get Michael on board. Actually, let's focus on the ones that are more progressive, who are more curious, learn from them, learn what works, and share that more widely with the organization. I think also we should be more bullish in measuring line manager performance. If you think we hold managers accountable for financial performance, operational performance, customer service performance, even health and safety performance, but we don't hold them accountable for people performance. And I think we need both carrot and stick.
Great. Thank you, Lucy. I'll now go to Ian's question. Ian, I hope I'm interpreting this the right way, so do let me know if I'm not. So as he's part of a non-commercial organization, he wondered if you felt companies like the BBC, where everyone is very committed to the cause, the change can be less disruptive, maybe to companies who have more of a stakeholder in the financials and take, more reward from the financials.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to correct you, Ben, but I think
please do.
I think he's actually saying it slightly differently. I think what he's saying is it's harder in, when you've got a commercial driver, actually will people kind of go, I can see that we have to change to achieve that because revenues are dropping. Whereas when you don't have, he's confirming that it's harder and cause driven. I completely agree with you, Ian. And I think what's made even worse in large purpose-led organizations is that they have their own personal version of what that purpose is. So at the BBC, you had people in, like, we were trying to save money, and you had, I would get groups of leaders together and I would say, right, it looks as if we're going to have to cut a program area or service. What do you think it should be? And they'd all be pointing at each other, cut Radio 3, nobody cares about that, or cut BBC 3, nobody cares about that. They all have their version of what the purpose of the organization is. And so I think that whilst pride levels are through the roof, and that's brilliant, achieving change, it almost strikes them on a kind of causal level. And I think that can be really problematic. I think personal reaction to change it's not necessarily that it's more extreme in purpose-led organizations, but I think that they fight for longer. I think whereas in a commercial organization, you will get extreme reaction if they're, back to the scarf model, if they feel that their status is threatened or their autonomy is threatened, but they will get through it. They get over it. And I think, one of the strategies that I've used is to say, look, I know this is painful for you, and I know that the reaction you're having is a very emotional reaction, and I get it and I understand it, and I'm going to give you some time. Have some time. You can come and shout at me. You can take some time out. I'm going to allow that emotional, irrational response, but it's time limited. At some point, they have to kind of get back on board. But I think sometimes just giving people permission to have that emotional outburst or that, is fine. You can't expect them to immediately be okay with it and on board with it when their brain's going haywire. I think the problem with, as Ian makes the point, I think the problem with purpose-led organizations is that it feels so much more fundamental to them, and they'll fight for it for longer. Like when we tried to close Six Music down, we had blooming David Bowie and, Jarvis walking down Regent Street. It's like really, really hard.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks both for confirming that question in the right way and taking it with the answer. I think we've probably got time for one more. So I'm going to pick this one from Sean, who has been very complimentary about one of your recent books.
Oh, lovely. That's nice.
He also asked, how do you feel the HR profession can imply some of these strategies themselves? HR can be a lonely place. So do you have any good examples?
Yeah, I think that everything I've talked about here, we need to apply to ourselves. I love the fact that Sky, for example, they will always use the HR team as the early adopters. I think we've got to be able to prove that we do it ourselves and that it works. I think sometimes we are our own worst enemies, where we won't do the things that we're telling other people. So I do think we need to make sure that we are at the vanguard and the early adopters. I also think that, we always know there's a restructure going on. It's probably impacting us and our team as well, but we're the last ones to think about our own well-being and resilience. And I think that's up to the HR leader. It can be an incredibly lonely place. And of course, it's often inappropriate to be talking to other colleagues in the organization when you're in HR. And I think this is where, a support mechanism that OpenUp offers, that external support, in a relatively cost-effective way, is a really good investment, because, what you don't want is for your own team to be keeling over. And they're usually so resilient and so strong. But then when everybody else is kind of like, right, great, we've done the restructure, we've all recovered, we're kind of and they've got all this blooming energy and our team's on the floor, So I think we have to factor that in. And, no one wants to hear about our whinging or our upset or our issues or our complaints. We just have to accept that it goes with the job, and it can be a very lonely place. You're absolutely right. So making sure that we have got those people to speak to in a safe space is really important.
Great. Yeah, I think it goes to trust and kind of understanding across an organization as well, right? Everyone needs to understand the chaos that is being caused and how that might be on someone else.
Yeah.
That's great. We've got 5 minutes. Maybe we can do a very quick answer, if you don't mind.
I'll be very quick, I promise.
So Anna has said, would you have any advice on how to implement such strategies in an environment which is currently experiencing stress? So maybe not the easiest one.
It's a really interesting question. And of course, when you're in stress mode, individually, collectively, organizationally, then you are in fight, flight, or freeze. And so your ability to sit back, to reflect, is impaired. And what we're talking about here with a lot of these approaches is so much easier to do pre-big restructure or pre-big significant change. And sometimes those changes cannot be foreseen and you're in the middle of it and, you just have to get on. I think what I've found, though, is that most people, back to this surge capacity, they have the ability to be incredibly resilient for short periods of time. So they will step up, they will work crazy hours, they will show unbelievable levels of resilience. It's when things calm down. So probably right now you have got people who are in fight, flight, or freeze. And I think sometimes having conversations which are getting people to reflect on those kind of in the grip behaviors can be useful. But sometimes you kind of have to wait for the crisis to be starting to calm down a bit for people to even have the headspace to engage with this stuff. Going along with some helpful well-being strategies around connecting to a sense of purpose and showing that you care about their career when leaders are worrying about, paying the payroll bill is not going to work. So I think we have to pick our moments.
Great. Thanks, Lucy. And answered in perfect timing. I just wanted to say thank you very much again. It was a lovely and fantastic masterclass. Thank you for all the input, and it was super insightful. And also thanks to everyone who attended and also for the questions. It's always nice to see everyone's kind of views and deeper understanding of things. And I think asking questions is very important to do that. And just as a reminder, we do have other masterclasses and roundtables throughout the year for the community. We've also just launched our very own podcast as well, which you can find on all the podcast apps and stuff like that. So Spotify, Apple and things. Others are available, I'm sure. And if you'd like to keep informed about different HR topics or mental wellbeing topics, my colleague should have just shared some links in the chat so you can have a look at them. And if you guys have any questions at all, you can reach out to us. Please do get in touch and we'll do our best to get back and speak to everyone and help out. We hope to see you again soon. And thanks a million, Lucy.
It's been my pleasure. Bye now.
Take care, everyone. Bye.